The wind howled through the cracked stone corridors of the monastery, carrying with it an ancient chill that seemed to bite deeper than the mountain air outside. Brother Ansel stood before the sealed wing of the library, his flickering lantern casting trembling shadows on the iron-studded door. It had been centuries since anyone had entered. The key he held in his trembling hand was said to be just as old. No one spoke of what lay inside, only that the wing had been sealed for reasons that holy orders deemed sufficient. Yet Ansel had been dreaming of this door for weeks, vivid visions of an ink-stained room and whispering shadows, dreams he could not shake. He told himself it was his curiosity as a scholar, not the strange pull of those dreams, that had finally brought him here. The air inside felt wrong as soon as the door creaked open. It was cold, oppressive, as if the room exhaled centuries of stale breath at once and swallowed the warmth of his lantern. The shelves were impossibly tall, cloaked in dust, and the faint skeletal remains of cobwebs. Ansel noted the absence of even a single mouse scurrying past, as if life itself had long abandoned this place. His steps echoed too loudly as he moved deeper into the endless rows of forgotten tomes. Pausing before a desk laden with ancient manuscripts, he saw marks scratched into its surface, patterns and symbols that made his eyes ache to look at. As he reached out to brush the dust from one sigil, he felt it before he saw it, an almost imperceptible shift. Like the room itself had leaned closer to him, waiting, listening. The whispers began slowly, no louder than the rustle of parchment, and he turned sharply, lantern swinging. Nothing. He reminded himself it was just the old stone and wood settling, but each step forward was heavier, as though the air itself resisted him. He caught glimpses of movement at the edge of his vision. Shadows stretching unnaturally long, books tilting on shelves though there was no draft. Soon the whispers grew clearer, weaving together into fragmented voices, patient and eerily conversational, as though they had all the time in eternity to notice him. He stopped in his tracks, gripping the lantern with white-knuckled force. The suspicion struck him, sudden and suffocating, that the room was no longer as empty as it had seemed, yet the books above all, were watching him as he watched them. Something moved behind him, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. He whirled, the lantern casting crazed, frantic light, but all he found was his own boot print in the dust. Only there were 2 more inches beside it, too wide, too deep. Every nerve screamed for him to flee, yet his legs refused to obey as the lantern dimmed and the shadows deepened, converging. It was in the heavy silence that he felt the first tug at his mind, a soft, seductive urge to turn back toward the desk. He resisted, biting down hard on the inside of his cheek, but the sigils now seemed alive on their own, bleeding through the pages of half-decayed books in an unholy dance. As the lantern flickered its final breath and darkness overtook him, Ansel felt the undeniable truth consume him. The room had never been sealed to keep others out. It had been sealed to keep whatever was inside from escaping. The wind clawed at the old lighthouse keeper's cottage, its shattered windows vibrating faintly with every forceful gust. Aaron had found it by chance, a crumbling relic hidden among jagged cliffs and overgrown brambles. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something sour beneath it, a faint odor that pricked at the edges of her awareness. She should have left after finding the gaping holes in the roof and the walls streaked with moss. But there was something irresistibly deliberate about how the single trapdoor sat in the center of the room, its iron handle streaked with rust and claw marks etched faintly into the surrounding floorboards. It wasn't curiosity that compelled her to stay, but an almost magnetic pull, an anchor of reason whispering that if she left now, she might never forgive herself. The beams of her flashlight painted the room in stark contrasts, but the trapdoor absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Erin knelt beside it, her pulse beating a slow but deliberate rhythm in her ears. With a hesitant breath, she reached out, her fingertips brushing the corroded handle. For a moment she froze, struck by the distinct sensation that she was being watched. But the room was still, silent except for the wind moaning through the timbers like a chorus of distant voices. Before she could convince herself to stop, Erin pulled on the handle, gritting her teeth as the door groaned and revealed a staircase descending into darkness. The smell of earth and old seaweed wafted upward, but woven into it was something else, something sharper, like burnt hair. The steps seemed endless, each creak of the wood echoing like a scream swallowed by the abyss. Erin's flashlight flickered uncertainly, its beam revealing walls of packed earth, interrupted only by deep scratches that spiraled downward as though made by something vast and desperate. She told herself they were old, the marks of time and weather, yet they seemed fresh, almost glistening as her fingers brushed against them for balance. At the bottom of the staircase was a narrow corridor, the air heavy with damp and an unnatural stillness. She couldn't hear the wind anymore, couldn't feel the trembling groan of the storm above. It was as though she had stepped into another world, sealed off, forgotten. As Erin moved deeper, the faint sound of dripping water began, too rhythmic, too purposeful to be natural. The corridor ended abruptly in a single wooden door, its surface covered with rows of jagged runes that seemed to ripple under her gaze. Erin hesitated, her heart now a chaotic drumbeat against her ribs. The magnetic pull that had guided her here grew insistent, a voice in her mind urging her forward in a tone that felt somehow familiar, like a half-forgotten memory. She reached out and touched the door, gasping as her flashlight blinked out, plunging her into complete darkness. For a moment there was silence, and then a sound from the other side. A whisper, low and hoarse, unmistakably her own voice saying, "Don't." Yet even in those words lay an inescapable knowing that it was already too late. The opera house had been silent for years, its grand chandelier collecting dust, and its velvet seats sagging with disuse. Eleanor wandered through the dressing rooms, drawn by the irresistible call of a forgotten past. She had always felt the weight of voices that lingered here. But tonight, something was different. In the dim light of her flashlight, she traced a peculiar seam in the wallpaper, a panel obscured by time and neglect. Her fingers grazed its edges, the faintest hint of movement betraying its hidden hinge. As it creaked open, a chill swept through the stagnant air, carrying a faint, sour whisper of perfume. Behind the panel wasn't just a hollow compartment, it was a narrow staircase descending into blackness. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She stepped inside, her heart a frantic metronome in the cavernous hush. The staircase spiraled down much farther than the building's foundation should have allowed, every step a test of her nerve. The air grew heavier, the light from her flashlight shrinking as though consumed by the darkness itself. The silence, too, wasn't true silence. It hummed faintly, a low vibration that made her ears ache. At the bottom she found a room, impossibly large and cloaked in shadows. Dust motes danced around crude mirrors nailed to the walls, their surfaces warped as if they were trickling downward. In the center, a mannequin stood, draped in shimmering, too-perfect fabric that seemed to ripple even though the air was still. But the mannequin wasn't lifeless. its head tilted ever so slightly as Eleanor entered, the faint scrape of movement freezing her mid-step. Something inside her warned against staying, yet a force, unseen and relentless, urged her forward. The fabric it wore began to move, unraveling in thin, silken threads that stretched toward her like searching fingers. Eleanor backed away, the flashlight trembling in her hand. As the threads reached, they swayed like they remembered her, years of intimate rehearsals replaying in an alien and haunting dance. Her memories flickered back, her mother, the star soprano, vanishing one stormy night during a final rehearsal. Her search had always ended with closed doors and dead ends, but now here she was, pulled not by curiosity but by a compulsion she couldn't explain. Her mother's voice filled the room suddenly, soft and broken, muffled like it came from behind layers of water. It wasn't coming from the mannequin, but from the mirrors, which rippled as though something lived just beneath their surfaces. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This was no discovery. This was a meeting that had been waiting for her much longer than she'd realized. The mirrors began to quake, jagged cracks splintering across their surfaces until the fragments peeled away, revealing voids that pulsed like living wounds. Hands, pale and fragile, yet too long to be human, clawed their way out, followed by twisted forms cloaked in phantoms of opera costumes. They surrounded her, their mouths moving but producing no sound, their eyeless faces fixated on Eleanor, as though they were asking for something they'd forgotten how to name. Behind her, the mannequin silently dissolved into a mass of threads that began weaving themselves into an outline. Her mother, or a cruel imitation of her, gazing at her from across the room. Her voice returned, faint, pleading, "You shouldn't have come." Eleanor's limbs locked, her voice betraying her attempt to scream as the fabric found her. Wrapping her tightly, the shadows loomed larger as the costumes began to sing in discordant whispers, drawing her deeper into the cold, eternal silence. Above her, the hidden panel clicked shut,